If you take vitamin D the way most Poles do, you're probably just excreting it in your stool. Literally. And you can forget about any beneficial effects. In this video, I'll show you how vitamin D works. Why do most people take it incorrectly, and what can you do to effectively raise its level in your body? My name is Monika Wijwa. I'm an aesthetic medicine doctor from Krakow, and I have some important information for you. Up to 90% of vitamin D from supplements may not be absorbed but simply wasted if you take it on an empty stomach instead of with fats. However, this information is just the beginning of what you need to know to truly impact your body and ensure you have the right amount of this vitamin. But let's start from the beginning. Vitamin D is crucial in 3 aspects. First, it is important for the immune system. It helps the body defend itself against infections and regulates inflammatory responses, which also affects autoimmune diseases such as psoriasis or Hashimoto's disease. Secondly, vitamin D is essential for healthy bones because it facilitates the absorption of calcium and phosphorus and prevents osteoporosis. It also affects mood and brain function, and its deficiency is associated with a higher risk of depression. Thirdly, and most importantly for me as an aesthetic medicine doctor, vitamin D affects the skin. A proper level of vitamin D helps maintain adequate skin hydration and its protective barrier, and people with higher concentrations of it have a better hydrated stratum corneum. In short, vitamin D affects the condition of the complexion and delays the skin aging process. Indirectly, this is due to its anti-inflammatory action and support for cellular renewal. Vitamin D is involved in the growth of skin cells and helps regulate the process of exfoliating the epidermis. It has anti-inflammatory properties. It has been shown that its active forms can alleviate skin inflammations. For example, they are used in ointments for psoriasis. However, a word of caution. All these beneficial effects of vitamin D occur only when we have enough of it in our bodies. You might be surprised when I say this, but you probably have too little vitamin D in your body. Why do I think so? A study was conducted involving 2,700 Polish men and women in which their vitamin D levels were measured in February. It turned out that 90% of the people studied showed a severe deficiency or shortage of vitamin D. This means that 9 out of 10 Poles have too little vitamin D in their bodies, and what's worse, 7 out of 10 had a severe deficiency. The problem with vitamin D among Poles is very serious. So serious, in fact, that only one other important nutrient deficiency comes close to these shameful statistics. I'm talking about omega-3 fatty acid deficiencies, but that's a topic for a separate video. Leave a comment if you'd like me to make a video about omega-3 supplementation. Alright, so we know that a lot of Poles have too little vitamin D. But this raises some questions. Why is this still a problem if you keep hearing that people in your family or among your friends are supplementing with vitamin D? Or are these deficiencies only an issue in winter? Or maybe in summer too? Or do other nationalities, for example Italians in the sunny south of Europe or Norwegians in the north, who on the other hand have little sunlight, also have such problems? I'll answer first the question. Is it true that the further north you go on the map, the greater the deficiencies? Because if vitamin D comes from the sun, logic suggests that Spaniards and Italians should be in a better situation than, for example, Poles. And the residents of, say, the aforementioned Norway should really have it the worst. Well, not exactly. There is a concept called the Mediterranean paradox, which states that vitamin D deficiencies are common throughout Europe, not just in countries where there is little sunlight. For example, in Spain, Italy, or Greece, the percentage of people with a deficiency can be higher than in Norway or Sweden, as these studies show. According to the same studies, vitamin deficiency occurs in less than 20% of the population in Northern Europe, in 30 to 60% in Western, Southern, and Eastern Europe, and in as much as 80% of residents of Middle Eastern countries. Something doesn't add up here, does it? That's because vitamin D doesn't come only from the sun. And now it's time for us to finally and clearly establish how vitamin D is produced in the body. The human body can obtain vitamin D in 2 main ways: through synthesis in the skin under the influence of sunlight and from the diet. And the fact that diet also matters answers my earlier question. How is it possible that a Norwegian or a Swede can have higher vitamin D levels than someone from Southern Europe? Unless, of course, besides eating salmon, they also go on vacation. More seriously, awareness about vitamin D has existed in northern countries for a long time. They also use what's called food fortification there, which means enriching food with vitamin D. Besides that, people there consume more supplements and fish. Exactly. Let's talk about how to get vitamin D from your diet. The bad news is that very few foods contain significant amounts of vitamin D. The best sources include fatty sea fish, such as herring, mackerel, or salmon. Also cod liver oil, egg yolks, and liver. In plants, vitamin D is present only as vitamin D2, for example in mushrooms and yeast, which has its drawbacks, I'll talk about that in a moment. It's worth mentioning that in Poland, food is not fortified with vitamin D as it is in northern countries. Moreover, fish consumption in Poland is low, but even if it were high, calculations show that you would have to eat, for example, several hundred grams of fatty fish, several dozen eggs, or drink over a dozen liters of milk every day to meet your daily requirement. What conclusion can we draw from this? Your diet should be healthy and varied, but in practice, you can't really count on even the healthiest food providing you with enough vitamin D in your body. It is estimated that under optimal conditions, at most 20% of vitamin D can be supplied through diet, while the production of vitamin D from sunlight covers as much as about 80 to 100% of the body's needs. That's why we need to talk about the most important thing, the production of vitamin D from sunlight. We Poles have one big problem with this natural production. In Poland, skin synthesis of vitamin D is effective only in late spring and summer, which means that in early spring, autumn, and winter, we're out of luck in this regard. How is this possible? The UV index will explain this. The UV index is a number that shows how strong the ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth is at a given moment and in a given place. Now take a look at what the UV index looks like for my city, Krakow, throughout the year, month by month. When it comes to the natural production of vitamin D from the sun, there are a few things you need to know because there are so many stereotypes and misconceptions around this topic that it makes my head spin. The first myth is that you have to spend a long time in the sun to produce enough vitamin D. That's not true. It's enough to spend at least 15 minutes in the sun every day and expose at least 18% of your skin's surface, that is, your forearms and partially your legs, and not cover it with sunscreen. That amount of time is enough for a fair-skinned person to synthesize between 2,000 and 4,000 units of vitamin D3, and we'll come back to sunscreens later. The second myth is that you can stock up on vitamin D, meaning, for example, that you can go on vacation and, by spending long hours in the sun, produce enough for your body to use in the following days. Unfortunately, that's not true either. So if instead of the 15 minutes I mentioned, you spend, for example, 3 hours in the sun, you won't produce significantly more than what you did in those first 15 minutes. Vitamin D is not stored, or at least not to the extent that even 3 trips to the tropics in winter would be enough to avoid taking supplements. I'll talk more about maintaining vitamin D levels later. Thirdly, what's also untrue is the whole myth about UV radiation. Vitamin D synthesis occurs due to UVB radiation, which is the type of radiation responsible for tanning. However, few people know that there is also another type, UVA radiation, which has destructive effects on the skin and accelerates aging like nothing else. I've recorded a separate video about this, which you should definitely watch later. Fourthly, the biggest myth is that sunscreen blocks the body's natural production of vitamin D. Why is this a myth? Because, as you already know, it only takes 15 minutes and just 18% of exposed skin without sunscreen to produce your entire supply of vitamin D. And it's impossible to cover your entire body completely with sunscreen. Remember that the skin between your fingers, on your knuckles, behind your ears, between the hairs on your head, on your arms, legs, or feet, also synthesizes vitamin D. So you can safely apply sunscreen to your face, neck, and chest without worrying about reducing your natural production of this vitamin. At the same time, you'll be taking care of your appearance, since UV radiation ages the skin. Moreover, there are studies that have scientifically proven that even diligent and long-term use of SPF sunscreen does not reduce the amount of vitamin D in the body. Besides, every sunscreen rubs off and degrades on the skin, remaining effective for only 4 to 6 hours. Alright, so now we know that on one hand we don't have to worry about SPF filters, but in any case, at our latitude, we can't rely on the sun to produce vitamin D for most of the year. So where should we get vitamin D from then? There is one certain option, supplements, and now I'll talk about them. However, before I tell you about supplementation, I have an important announcement. On my website drmonica.pl, I've prepared a free challenge for you called 5 Days to Better Skin. In it, you'll receive completely free, specific guidelines on how to easily take better care of your skin's appearance at home. The challenge is completely free, and it could change your life. So check out the link in the description and join the challenge along with thousands of other people. In this part of the video, I'll specifically explain which vitamin D to supplement, how much and when during the day, so you can be among the top 9 Poles who don't have deficiencies. I have a few specific tips for you that are worth applying. Which vitamin D is best for supplementation? There are many products on the market, and most often you'll find vitamin D2 and D3. Which one is better to supplement? To explain this, you need to know that the vitamin D circulating in your body is different from the vitamin D you consume in supplements. The stored form, which the body creates in the liver from the vitamin D you take in, is called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. So you take vitamin D in tablet form, which your body then converts into hydroxyvitamin D. It is precisely this level of hydroxyvitamin D that we measure in the body to determine deficiency. But I'll talk more about the tests later. And now, let's get back to whether vitamin D2 or vitamin D3 is better for supplementation. Numerous studies indicate that vitamin D3 is more effective at raising the level of hydroxyvitamin D in the body. How much more effective? According to research, even by as much as 40%. So if you go to the pharmacy, make sure you're buying vitamin D3, not D2. However, those aren't all the decisions you'll have to make, because at the pharmacy, the clerk will also ask whether you want capsules, tablets, or maybe drops. The most important thing is that the supplement contains vitamin D dissolved in oil. This increases its absorption because vitamin D is one of the fat-soluble vitamins. Most softgel capsules already contain an oil-based filler, such as olive oil, and drops are simply a solution of vitamin D3 in oil. Both of these forms are very well absorbed by the body. So which form is the best? Objectively speaking, the best form would be the liquid one because it is absorbed a bit more easily, meaning it is more bioavailable. On the other hand, I advise against regular tablets because they don't contain any additives or fats and will be absorbed more slowly. A convenient compromise is gel capsules, which are easy to use and dose. This is an advantage over the liquid form, and they usually contain added fats, which is an advantage over old-fashioned tablets. Okay, so now you know that vitamin D3 in drops or capsules makes the most sense, but that's still not everything. At the pharmacy, you'll find products where vitamin D3 is combined with vitamin K2. Why is this done, and does it matter? Generally speaking, no. There are studies indicating that such a combination of vitamins works well for bones, helping to maintain their proper density, which we lose with age. Such a combination would be especially important for people with bone diseases, for example osteoporosis, but also when you are taking high doses of vitamin D over 4,000 units. However, adding vitamin K2 is not mandatory. D3 is the foundation. K2 can help if you have problems with your bones and blood vessels, or if you take high doses of vitamin D, but not everyone needs it, and some companies add it mainly as a marketing gimmick. Now we come to an important point in this video, which may determine whether your supplement will work at all, even if you take enough of it. Several times in this video, it was mentioned in the background that vitamin D is fat-soluble. However, this is not just a background detail, but something you should definitely remember for life. Vitamin D needs fats in order to be properly absorbed by the body. The point is that the entire amount of vitamin D you take will never be fully absorbed by your body and used up 100%. It's like when you bake a cake and there's always a bit of flour left on the counter. The key is not to leave, say, half a kilogram of flour on the counter because it will make a mess and your cake will turn out dense and underbaked. It's the same with your body. When you take supplements, there are always some losses along the way, and out of 2,000 units of vitamin D, the full 2,000 units will never be converted into hydroxyvitamin D. To ensure that as much vitamin D as possible is absorbed by your body, you need to provide the right conditions. The average absorption rate is 50 to 80%, but this depends on several factors. First and foremost, it depends on how much vitamin D you currently have in your body, your parathyroid hormone levels, whether there are any inflammations, liver problems, and finally, whether vitamin D is taken together with fats. So let's answer the question, does the time of day matter? Yes, it does, but it's not about the time on the clock, it's about something else. Because vitamin D is fat-soluble, it should be taken with a meal. Moreover, I found studies that clearly indicate that supplementing vitamin D, not with just any meal, but with the largest meal of the day, produces the best results in raising hydroxyvitamin D levels. So, the time of day in terms of the hour doesn't matter as much as long as you take it with your largest meal. So if lunch is your most caloric or fat-rich meal of the day, then that's the best time to take the supplement. And if, like me, dinner is your largest meal, then it's better to take vitamin D in the evening. Exactly, but should you take vitamin D every day or perhaps irregularly, occasionally using a higher number of units? I found studies in the form of a meta-analysis that clearly indicate that for raising 25-hydroxyvitamin D, it doesn't matter. In other words, supplementing vitamin D daily is just as effective as taking it irregularly but thoughtfully. However, I have two arguments that support leaning towards daily intake. First of all, it's more convenient because it becomes a habit and we don't have to remember about it. Secondly, there is no risk of overdosing on vitamin D with small amounts taken daily, as there is with occasionally taking very large amounts. I'll talk more about vitamin D overdose later, so make sure to watch this video until the end. However, before we talk about overdosing, we need to discuss dosing. We're moving on to the most important part of the video, where I'll explain how much vitamin D is worth taking in supplements. When I was preparing for this video, I checked what popular internet search queries there are about vitamin D. It turned out that there are a lot of questions like vitamin D 3-4,000 units or more. And this brings me to the first but very important thought regarding the doses of vitamin D you should be taking, which is, don't do it blindly. What do I mean by that? At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that 91% of Poles have too little vitamin D during the winter season. However, until you get tested yourself, you don't know if you might actually be among the remaining 9%, and in that case, taking vitamin D wouldn't necessarily be a good idea. Besides, you should consult your family doctor before taking any supplement. And if your family doctor doesn't want to talk about it or doesn't have time, which I often hear about in the comments, then change your doctor because your health depends on it. Testing your vitamin D level is not covered by the National Health Fund, which is a shame because it should be. And the cost of such a test is several dozen zlotys. And coming back to the topic of dosage, you already know it's worth checking, but how do you do it? It's simple. You need to do a blood test at a diagnostic center. The test you should do is specifically for the level of 25-hydroxyvitamin D. If the result is below 30 nanograms per milliliter, you should supplement vitamin D. If it's above that, then no. Next, if supplementation is needed, you start it with your doctor, and after some time you repeat the test to check if it's working. The point is that sometimes even a lot of supplemented units may not actually result in a real increase in hydroxyvitamin D levels. And then you think you're doing something, but in reality, nothing is changing. And in such a situation, you need to review everything I've talked about so far in the video to look for the causes. Of course, we also don't want to overdose on vitamin D, and that's what the tests are for as well. Alright, so how many units of vitamin D should you take then? Numerous studies indicate that taking 2,000 units of vitamin D daily brings only benefits. It reduces the risk of all those unwanted issues related to deficiencies. So those 2,000 units can serve as a baseline amount, from which you can adjust up or down depending on your needs. According to researchers, daily supplementation with vitamin D at a dose of 2,000 units, which is 50 micrograms, can be considered a simple, effective, and safe method for preventing and treating vitamin D deficiency in the general adult population. Basically, the greater the vitamin D deficiency, the more you should consider a higher dose in consultation with your doctor. In cases of severe deficiency, less than 10 nanograms per milliliter, more than 4,000 units per day are used until the results normalize. For milder deficiencies, in the range below 30 nanograms per milliliter, the recommended amount is between 2,000 and 5,000 units. A reasonable strategy may be to supplement with 2,000 units from late spring and during the summer, and then increase the dose to 4,000 units per day in the fall, winter, and early spring. In addition, seniors over the age of 75 should generally take more vitamin D than healthy adults. Similarly, people struggling with obesity should have higher doses because body weight affects concentration levels. And what about doses higher than 4,000 units? Is it worth using them? Of course, the key factors are the patient's needs and the results of vitamin D level tests, without which it's hard to make a good decision. However, other studies indicate that for the general population, a daily dose of vitamin D3 ranging from 4,000 to 6,000 units, which allows for achieving a blood level of hydroxyvitamin D between 40 and 70 nanograms per milliliter, would provide better protection against many adverse health effects. However, these values of several thousand units are only for some products because you can get much larger amounts of units, but only with a prescription. Exactly. Is prescription vitamin D3 a good idea? In Poland, there are many vitamin D preparations available by prescription, where the amount of units is not just a few, but already several dozen thousand or even tens of thousands of units. There are even preparations reaching 100,000 units, which is a very, very large amount. Such medications are definitely not used as supplements, but under strict medical supervision when the patient's health condition requires it. Treatment may require the use of so-called loading doses, meaning large amounts administered at once. This is one way to address the deficiencies I mentioned a moment ago. I'm talking about the daily or occasional intake of vitamin D. If you want to learn more, check out these studies. Besides, when it comes to prescription drugs, this area is much more regulated than the supplement market. Much more regulated because the supplement market is hardly controlled at all. That's why vitamin D available as a medication rather than a supplement is always the safer option. We know exactly that the amount of vitamin D in the medication matches what the manufacturer declares. Moreover, the medication has been tested and is safe for us as patients. If you've already imagined those huge amounts of vitamin D units, we need to answer a very important question. Is it possible to overdose on vitamin D supplements and harm your health? My short answer is yes. Overdosing on vitamin D is possible, but it's very difficult to do. First of all, it's impossible to overdose on vitamin D from sunlight. Those 15 minutes of exposure and 18% of the body uncovered is basically the maximum the body can produce. And after that, you can't produce any more or store it for the next month. The safe upper intake limit for adults is about 4,000 units per day for most of the population, but toxicity usually requires much higher doses, tens of thousands of units per day for many weeks. Of course, it's possible to overdose on vitamin D, just like with anything else, but it would require taking large doses of supplements over a long period of time. We're talking about tens of thousands of units for many weeks. So it's actually difficult to overdose on vitamin D. Unless, of course, you have a hypersensitivity to vitamin D. Exactly. Certain diseases, such as sarcoidosis, tuberculosis, and lymphomas, cause hypersensitivity to vitamin D. In such patients, the body produces too much of the active form of vitamin D, and symptoms of overdose can occur even with normal exposure or supplementation. However, these are exceptional situations. In reality, vitamin D overdose is so rare that developed countries do not keep statistics on people who have overdosed. And in the literature, individual cases are described more as curiosities. What could happen if you overdosed on vitamin D? Such symptoms would involve hypercalcemia, which means too much calcium in the body. Why calcium? Vitamin D increases the absorption of calcium from the intestines. The more vitamin D you have, the more calcium enters your body. Expected symptoms include nausea, recurrent vomiting, loss of appetite, intense thirst and dehydration, frequent urination, and abdominal pain. Nephrologists especially dislike overdoses. Calcium buildup in the kidneys can lead to kidney failure. The symptoms would become increasingly serious depending on the degree of overdose, so it's important to realize that overdosing on vitamin D is just as dangerous as being deficient in it. That's why I encourage you to get tested before taking supplements. Especially since, according to statistics, we Poles like to take supplements for every occasion. How long does vitamin D stay in the body after supplementation? Regardless of whether you take 2,000 units, 5,000 or 50,000, you need to know how long such a dose will remain in your body. Let me remind you that what supplements contain is vitamin D3, which in the body is converted into 25-hydroxyvitamin D. The biological half-life of 25-hydroxyvitamin D is about 15 days. This means that roughly every 2 weeks, the concentration of stored vitamin D drops by half if we don't supply more. In practice, after stopping supplementation, the levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D will gradually decrease. Deficiency symptoms, for example in the middle of winter, may return after a few weeks or months, depending on the initial saturation. That's why I mentioned earlier that even a few trips to the tropics in winter may not be enough to protect yourself from deficiency. In people who initially had a very high level of hydroxyvitamin, for example 80 to 100 nanograms per milliliter, the excess will persist longer, even for several months, which is important when treating hypervitaminosis. The effects can last for weeks. On the other hand, in people who are just at the borderline of the normal range, their reserves can be depleted after just 1 or 2 months without supplementation. That's why regular intake is important, because after the summer season, levels drop relatively quickly during the darker months. This is another argument in favor of daily supplementation in relatively small amounts. Dear ones, I hope that with this video, I was able to convey important knowledge to you in an understandable way. If that's the case and you learned something new, be sure to leave me a comment under this video to help its reach. In this video, I talked a lot about why vitamin D helps with the appearance of the skin. However, I didn't mention other supplements that are worth taking to maintain a youthful appearance and good skin at home. I've recorded a separate video on this topic where I gather all the best supplements for appearance and against aging. The thumbnail for that video is now showing on the screen. Be sure to click now and keep watching to learn important information about supplements. Thank you for watching this video and see you in the next one. Kisses!